Hello, everyone. Chamripsor, take off, Khmer. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to our CKS webinar series. I see that people are still trickling in at the moment, so we'll just take it slow here. So let me just tell you a little bit about CKS to start off with. The Center for Khmer Studies is a nonprofit organization that seeks to promote research and international scholarly exchange through programs that increase understanding of Cambodia and its region, and also to strengthen Cambodia's cultural and educational structures, and to integrate Cambodian scholars in both regional and in international exchange. I am Eve Zucker. I am an anthropologist and also the president of CKS. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with our special guest, Elena Lesley, about her work on memory of the Khmer Rouge past in this webinar that is titled Regeneration, Testimonial Mental Health, Treatment Among Survivors of the Khmer Rouge Regime. So before I introduce Elena, I would like to briefly go over a few pointers about today's events, a few housekeeping issues here. So the webinar will be in a discussion format, and it's going to last about an hour. And after that hour, we open it up to the audience for you to ask your questions. And that part of the webinar lasts about half an hour. The way that you will go about asking questions, if you would like to ask one, which we encourage you to do so, would be to do it in either two ways. One is if you're on the Zoom webinar platform, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. So that is where you would put our questions. And we won't be answering questions during the webinar, well, the first part of the webinar, but we will get to them, I promise, at the end. And for those of you who are on Facebook Live, you can put your questions into the comment box, and those will be passed over to our speaker for you. So as mentioned in the chat, this event is currently being recorded. So just keep that in mind and be aware of it. Okay, so now I get to introduce our special guest, Elena Lesley. So Elena is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Emory University. And she first came to Cambodia as a Henry Luce scholar to work as an editor and a staff writer for the Phnom Penh Post. And that was in 2004. Since that time, she has worked for over 16 years on projects related to memory of the Khmer Rouge period, tribunal-related outreach, and mental health. Her research has been published in several journals, including Ethos, Ethnos, and Genocide Studies and Prevention. Her work has also appeared in multiple edited volumes. Okay, so Elena was a CKS dissertation research fellow here, and also held a multi-country fellowship from the Council of American Overseas Research Centers to conduct research on memorial sites in Cambodia and Rwanda. So welcome, Elena.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I love all the wonderful work that CKS is doing, and I'm always excited about the announcements I get about speakers and events and projects and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's really wonderful to have you here. So before we get really too deep into your work here, which we hope to do, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, how did you first become interested in Cambodia, and more specifically also memory and trauma as it's associated with Cambodia's Khmer Rouge past?
Sure. Well, it all started, I would say, when I was graduating from college. And that was the time that I got the Henry Luce Fellowship. The Henry Luce Fellowship gives Americans a chance to go work in Asia for a year. And at the time that I got the Luce Fellowship, I got to choose which country in Asia I wanted to go work in. And that was a really big question for me because I didn't know, because I had actually never lived outside of the US before. I had barely traveled outside of the US. So it all seemed very abstract and theoretical to me. I couldn't imagine what any of these places was actually really like. And one of the reasons I was really interested in Cambodia was because I was interested in the question of how do individuals and societies move on from very violent pasts. And that was something that has been a lifelong interest of mine, partially because of my own family history. My mom's family came to the United States as refugees from the former Soviet Union after World War II. They actually had fled during World War II and escaped to Greece, where they had family members, and stayed in Greece for a number of years, and then were finally sponsored and able to come to the United States. But it was something that I was very much immersed in growing up, these stories of war, basically. So I kind of joke, it was like an unorthodox childhood, maybe in a number of ways, in that, especially when we spent time with my grandparents, I would wake up and eat, breakfast, and then there would be a 2-hour discussion of World War II at the breakfast table, those kinds of things. And so I just very much grew up, hearing about all these stories, and then also as being like the American in the family, since I was born in America and stuff, who would be like, you don't really understand, you've only ever lived in America, you don't know what it's like other places. And so I already had kind of this, question in my mind in terms of, well, what is it like other places? And how do people sort of move on, and how do societies try to restructure themselves after there have been these tremendous challenges and periods of tragedy in a lot of ways.
So I just have to say that I'm here nodding my head, because I say that what propelled you into it is exactly the same thing that propelled me into it. I too, wanted to know how societies moved on after mass violence and genocide. And my family also went through World War II and were refugees here to this country, although from Germany. So, yes, I definitely see the parallels, and I completely understand the motivations there.
Yeah, no, it sounds like there's a lot of overlap. Yeah, and it was something that my grandma especially was very much, she talked about it all the time. And I mean, it was, a very much always in the background of my childhood, these questions of World War II. And I did actually have a chance to go visit Ukraine in 2013, and that was really interesting for me. That was where my family had come from. And Ukraine was, very much sort of on the front line in terms of the battle between the Nazis and the Soviets. And there was a lot of, bloodshed there. And but it was very interesting when I went to Ukraine to see sort of the way that memory was used and evoked in sort of different nation building projects, I guess you would say. And especially a lot of the same memorials from the Soviet state and everything were still there. So I guess that's a little off topic, but if people are interested in these sort of comparative elements, that was a big part of it for me. And then a lot of what I heard, in Cambodia sounded familiar to me as well, because my family had come from being, in a communist society. And so a lot of the ideals were similar, and a lot of the sort of projects were similar. And I would say that also there were a lot of mixed feelings in my own family, because there, on the one hand, there were many things that were sort of admirable about this social undertaking. And on the other hand, it led to great tragedy. So there was always sort of this ambivalence in the way that they talked about their time in Soviet Ukraine.
Right, really very, very interesting. And that's actually the whole story with the Ukraine is quite fascinating. So I wanted to ask you, you came in 2004 and worked on the Phnom Penh Post, and then your sort of experiences in Cambodia and your work with the history of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge and so forth, it had an evolution to it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Evolution.
Yeah, so when I was first in Cambodia in 2004, as I said, I was just this fresh-faced, just out of college, it was kind of like my first job and my first experience living in another country. And I mean, I think a big part of it was timing too, in terms of like why Cambodia really stuck with me and why it became a place that had such a hold on me in a lot of ways, because I entered it very much with the feeling that I wanted to get to know as much about the people and about the country as I could. And I saw the Luce Fellowship was really supposed to be cultural immersion, like not just like a work training opportunity or something like that, but and I tried to take advantage, you know, of that element of it in any way that I could, in terms of, you know, going to my coworkers' houses in the countryside on the weekends, or participating in any sort of holidays and ceremonies and festivals. And I guess I sort of realized, Eve, over time, that I guess I was an anthropologist, actually, you know, because then I started meeting more people in anthropology, and I was like, wait, so this is what you're doing? And that's your work? Because this is just kind of like a hobby for me, you know? And so, so I'll talk about that in a minute. So I eventually, you know, sort of moved over into anthropology. As an undergrad, I had actually studied political science, which is also in the social sciences. But then I was at the Phnom Penh Post for that first year, and just had this sort of amazing and really impactful experience, you know, working as a journalist primarily, but also just getting to know the country and getting to know the people and getting to know the language a little bit. And then I came back to the US, and I was working as a journalist in the US, and I kept having the desire to go back to Cambodia to work on more projects. And I was particularly interested in what was going to happen with the Khmer Rouge tribunal, because I think that that was also sort of in the background. The idea of these war crimes tribunals and sort of Nuremberg as the precedent and all that was also something that was, you know, in the back of my mind. And I wanted to know how these sort of international justice processes could work, or would they work in different environments. And so I then came back to Cambodia in 2008 on a Fulbright grant to do a project more specifically related to the tribunal. At that point in time, you know, when I was first in Cambodia, it wasn't clear if the tribunal was really going to move forward. And then it wasn't clear to me anyway. Maybe it was clear to other people. And then by 2008, it was like things are really up and running, and we're about to have the first trial. And so I came back to do a project more specifically focused on that, and was very interested in the day-to-day operations of the court. And so I went to every session basically that I could, every time the court was in session, and was there for most of the first trial of Comrade Deutsch. And it was during that time that I really started to become more interested in moving into anthropology. And also I just the whole experience of being at the tribunal all that time and seeing everything involved was really fascinating. And I also at that time met Alex Hinton, who you know, who's a very you know, distinguished Cambodia scholar. And I had really, really loved his first book. And he's an anthropologist too. So that was another thing that sort of moved me in the direction of anthropology. And later, when I came back to the US, I did a master's program that was actually an interdisciplinary master's program in global affairs, but very much with an anthropological focus at Rutgers. Rutgers has a relationship with the Documentation Center of Cambodia, and Alex Hinton is there. And then it was during my master's work, as you mentioned, that I had a KORC grant to do multi-country research in both Cambodia and Rwanda on memorial sites. And that was another really fascinating opportunity for me because I had not spent time in Rwanda before. And so being able to compare that to the Cambodian experience. And, you know, in Rwanda, the violence was a lot more recent. So that was a big part of the difference, I would say. And of course, it's a different part of the world. And things unfolded in a somewhat different manner, and that there were these, you know, groups, these, I guess you would call ethnic groups that existed, and that a lot of the violence was targeted based on those social distinctions. But so I looked at visitation and engagement with Tolslang and Chung Ek in Cambodia, and then with 2 sites of memory in Rwanda. And one of the things also, just in terms of the role that memory plays in society, I don't know if you've been to Rwanda, but that I found very interesting there was that the idea of like a duty to remember and active remembrance is so strong in the society, to the extent that starting in April every year, there is a 100-day commemoration period of the genocide, which, I mean, is just a huge obligation for a society to make. And also the genocide is represented in so many different things, like popular culture, music videos, all those kinds of things. And that was really surprising to me. And some young people that I talked to about it in Rwanda, you know, I would talk to them and say, you know, not every country has music videos about genocide. And they would be surprised. And I say, really? They don't? You know, because everyone is used to sort of their own world and their own perspective. So, so doing that comparative study was really interesting. And
Right.
oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say that I haven't been to Rwanda, but I work quite closely with someone who works on Rwanda, David Simon, who's a political scientist at Yale. And so we do a lot of collaborative work together. So I'm learning more and more about Rwanda. And yes, they are quite different in quite a number of ways. But that's cool that you got the opportunity to study both.
Yeah. And then, of course, when I decided to continue and do a PhD in anthropology, it made sense for me to really focus on Cambodia, because that's where I had, you know, more history and more background. And I was continuing to develop my language skills and everything over time, which, as I'm sure you know, is a big project when you're not someone who has any natural speaking ability in Khmer to start out with. So, yeah, and so that was a big undertaking. And then that basically led me to my dissertation research. I had started off still interested in this idea of memory and memorials, but I wanted to look more at memory in the context of mental health treatment, because mental health was something that was also kind of in the background, that I felt like kept emerging during the different years that I had worked in Cambodia as a problem that people were grappling with, and oftentimes didn't have a lot of resources to deal with. And so that was really why I wanted to look at mental health. And then that was what led me to this particular therapeutic approach that I studied for my dissertation fieldwork, which is testimonial therapy.
Right. So was there anything in that time of, first working for the Phnom Penh Post and later attending the tribunal, and then the research you did while doing your master's, was there any particular events or things that happened that particularly drew your attention to mental health issues?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there were probably a lot of things, but I would say that oftentimes in interviews that I did with people, whether they were people who were coming on sort of tribunal outreach tours, where people came to see Tolslang or Chung Ek, and also were taken to the court itself. Or sometimes if I was going out into different provinces and interviewing people about the Khmer Rouge period, it came up a lot. The fact that, people wouldn't necessarily classify it as mental health and saying, I have a mental health problem or something like that, but just the symptoms that people would describe to me that they were suffering, especially things like sleeplessness and nightmares, and gutjaran, thinking too much, all of these kinds of things. I felt like it was consistently something that I heard, and that it was something that in a lot of ways it didn't seem like people had the resources to address. And I felt really bad about that, because I think also, as I said, back to tying it into my own family, I think that the burden of the mental impact of this sort of violence and displacement and stuff can have long lasting and also intergenerational effects. And especially if you're in a low resource setting where you don't have a lot of access to help and to treatment, it's very challenging, and it can affect people's lives in a lot of different ways and also affect their family networks.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So tell me, so you started your PhD, what year was it that you started your PhD?
2014.
In 2014. Okay. Okay. So you started that, and you got into this testimonial therapy approach. Can you tell us just a little bit about what testimonial therapy is and how it's been used, where it's been used?
Sure, definitely. That was, I think, one of the reasons that I was interested in testimonial therapy, just before I explain a little bit more about the background, was actually because dating back to when I had read, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, and in which she talked about the very important role of testimony in that trial, and how that was sort of a turning point in terms of this globalized idea of a survivor witness. And as someone who was a witness to atrocity, as being someone who was in a position of authority and had something, an important sort of message to convey to other people and to humanity. And how in her opinion too, I remember that it was like the testimony was almost therapeutic for people, going through that process of testifying in a trial. Now, of course, you can't have everyone testify in a trial. It's not logistically possible. And I think that was one of the issues with the Eichmann trial as well, is that there was so much testimony that it became kind of cumbersome, and that it was a little bit disorganized at times. And you can't have, every person who has experienced, human rights violations come forward and tell their whole story in the way that they want to do it in a legal setting. There just aren't the resources for it. So I think that's kind of where testimonial therapy fills in a gap, because it gives people the chance to offer their testimony in a therapeutic setting, and then they can still tell their story, and they can tell their story to a particular audience. And where it actually originated was in Latin America, in Chile, in the 1970s. And it was first used among survivors of political violence. And the human rights activists and psychotherapists were actually documenting people's stories for legal purposes in that case. It was actually for a legal case, which is an important distinction to keep in mind. The idea of like a legal testimony versus a therapeutic testimony, and what's involved in both. But in that case, they found that while they were eliciting these legal testimonies, that it seemed to have a therapeutic effect. And so later they turned this into sort of a standardized psychological method. And then testimonial therapy has actually been used in many different cultural contexts around the world. Now, I should explain a little bit the bare bones idea of how it works. So I should probably back up and do that, and then talk about how it's been used different places. But the idea, like I said, is just to have people tell and have documented their story of having lived through something very difficult, which is a broad thing to, because it could have been political violence, it could have been genocide, it could have been war. There are a lot of different things that people could create a testimony about. And usually the patients work one-on-one with a counselor to tell their story. And they do this over the course of several days. It's short and intensive. So it's usually over the course of 4 days that they work one-on-one and meet each day. And when I saw the counselors at TPO, every time that they did it, TPO being the Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, the organization in Cambodia that's been administering testimonial therapy, I mean, they worked very, very hard, and it was a very intensive process. And having to write down all of these different, recollections from a person's life, and then going home at night and typing them all up. And then they would go back the next day and check over with the person, okay, this is what we discussed yesterday. tell me if this is how you think about this, if this is how you want this represented, and then, moving on to different parts of their lives. And then finally, on the last day, they agree on and sort of solidify a version of the narrative that the person is comfortable with. And they have two different versions. One is a shorter version that is going to be read aloud in a public ceremony. And then they have a longer version that's just for them to keep. And because a lot of them are quite long, so it wouldn't be feasible to read them the entire testimony in a public ceremony. So then on the last day, they have a public ceremony in which this testimony is read out loud. And then I'll say something that's different about the way that it's been used in the Cambodian context is that this reading out loud is also combined with a spiritual ceremony, with a Buddhist ceremony. And that wasn't necessarily part of the initial testimonial therapy process, but it's something that's been added in over time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm really anxious to hear the rest of what you have to say, but while you were talking about testimony, it had me thinking a little bit about how it sounds very different than the type of testimony taking that, say, the Shoah Foundation does, where it's the beginning of life, the genocide, and then the aftermath, and it's all on, being recorded on video and then stored as is like that. There's not this sort of back and forth of reviewing and maybe changing things and coming up with a narrative at the end, or for that matter, it's also very different than the way that Dory Laub did it at the Fortunoff archive, where his approach was really just to listen and just to ask as few questions as possible and just listen and let the person speak. And I was wondering, what you think about, is there a special value in doing it the way that it's done in testimonial therapy, as you describe, that you feel is more therapeutic maybe in some situations than in others? Is there different types of taking of testimony for different purposes and for different situations and different cultural contexts?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And also those examples are really interesting because you're right, there are a number of different projects that sort of record people's personal histories or oral histories, and they're often done in different ways, or they might be done with like a standardized set of questions, or they might be video recorded. If you're video recording someone, that sort of adds a whole new element into the process. I think that with the way that I've seen the testimonial therapy done in Cambodia, that the back and forth is good and needed because it often takes people a while to sort of open up about their most difficult experiences. And so I would say that because sometimes maybe on the first day even, they'll talk a lot about someone's general life history and where they were at different points in time and their family and stuff. And maybe they won't even get into some of the most traumatic things that happened to them. And so that might be part of it. I mean, it's interesting because I always thought actually that if anything, it seemed like not enough time, that 5 days was not enough to sort of, confront all these things. But then, that's more than if you just sat down with someone for a few hours and video record them. So it does give a chance to maybe get a little bit deeper into some of those issues. And also if it is a situation which for whatever reason, people might not be as used to talking about themselves personally, to sharing that kind of information. It depends a lot on the person and the culture and the context. You're probably familiar with, in Cambodian, people often don't really valorize the I. There's not necessarily a huge emphasis on putting forth one's own story as an individual story. And people can be a little bit shy about doing that. So I think that that's part of it. And then I think also it's really important that they have to go back and sort of edit it, because it needs to be something that the person is comfortable with other people knowing about. So sometimes, there will be things that come out in therapy sessions that people then don't necessarily include in the final written document or in the public presentation, because it was something they wanted to tell someone, but ultimately, and the way testimonial therapy has been done is different in different places in terms of who the audience is. But a lot of times the audience is a person's family members and people in their community. And they're going to be continuing to live with these people. And they might want to be careful about managing a number of different relationships. And so I think that that's a big part of it too. And then there might be a difference in that sense, even between what the short version is that's read aloud and the longer version that people keep for themselves.
Right. I'm glad that you brought up that point about, how they are aware that whatever they say does affect the relationships that they have with people in their lives, and that they might tell things differently because of that to some extent, or would tell the story differently to different people. In different contexts, of course.
Absolutely. And so I think that that's a big part of it, is needing to also keep in mind the context. And that's different than if you're in a situation even that people in my family were, that you've come as an immigrant to a new country. And none of the people who you knew back in Ukraine are anywhere around. And,
right.
And in those days too, I mean, you couldn't even really communicate with Ukraine. Like it was, if they sent letters back and forth to family members and they'd be opened and things would be blacked out, because the government censors had gone through it. So there wasn't an open line of communication. So there was no concern, even like today that, we're being Facebook streamed now and stuff like that. There are so many different ways that information could come out. And even in terms of the personal version that people keep for themselves, people in their family could potentially see it. So they just want to be really careful about those kinds of things.
Right.
But I will say, if I have time, just a little bit more about how it's been used in different places.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think that's important to give like a little bit of the background about some of the wide application. As I said, it was first used in Chile, and then has been used with a lot of different groups of people. It's been used with refugees and immigrants in the United States. It's been used with women who are victims of intimate partner violence, which I thought was really interesting. There was a study done of the use of testimonial therapy for Latina victims of IPV, and they specifically incorporated Catholic elements into a ceremony in that one, in that instance. And then the way in which testimonial therapy was introduced to Cambodia was through a research project that actually spanned several different countries: India, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and Cambodia. And a group was moving between these countries and looking at the idea of whether a spiritual ceremony could be incorporated into the testimonial therapy process. And it was Inga Agger from Denmark who led this effort. And she worked with people in these different environments to try to create a ceremony, as I said, that would sort of conclude the testimonial therapy process, and which would hopefully make it sort of more culturally relevant. And in Sri Lanka, for example, they held the final ceremony in a Catholic mission station and had a Catholic priest run the ceremony. And in the Philippines, they had different ceremonies for different groups. They had one for Muslims and one for Catholics, and then a different ceremony just for political prisoners who had been communist detainees. And so then in Cambodia, when testimonial therapy was introduced, the staff at TPO worked with Inga Agar and then with other people, including Buddhist monks, to try to figure out how to create a spiritually relevant ceremony. And in this case, they decided to use the model of the Bangsokol ceremony and adapt it and incorporate testimonies into it. And so basically what happens usually at the end of the testimonial therapy process is the testimonies are read out loud in this adapted Bangsokol ceremony. And it's actually the counselors who usually read the testimonies, not the patients themselves. The patients come forward one by one, but the counselors do it, I think partially because it would just be too overwhelming for people, for many people, maybe not for everyone, but for many people to read it themselves. Although I will say there have been some people who have been really, really eager to tell their stories and will sort of say additional things after their testimony is read and say, I have some more to add to that. And then the testimonies, the documents are given to the monks who bless the documents and then returned to the patients. And there's a general blessing ceremony. And then the idea is that the merit that is generated through actually reading the testimony is dedicated to people's deceased loved ones. So
interesting.
Yeah, so it's a really nice idea that makes it really resonant for people. And especially this idea that you have in Cambodian Buddhism, that you have ongoing relationships and exchanges with the dead, as opposed to the idea in sort of, you would say, Protestant, say, memorialization practices, where you remember people as they were when they were alive, but then they become this sort of static being. In Cambodia, there are these sort of dynamic and ongoing exchanges.
Right. Absolutely. So you mentioned a number of the benefits of this type of therapy. I'm wondering, what would you say are some of its limitations?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would say going into this process, I honestly did not know how it was gonna work out. And that was one of the reasons that I was interested in the therapy, is that, so as a few, I guess you would say, disclaimers, I thought, to start off with, I was worried that it would not be appropriate in a number of different ways. One concern that I had was that people just might not want to talk about the past that much, that sometimes you do hear people say, it's better just to move on and to forget it and not to dwell on these things. And then also that ties into the idea of the problem of gutjuran, of thinking too much, that sometimes if you spend too much time ruminating on these things, it can serve as like a trigger to this downward spiral of negative rumination that can cause all sorts of psychological and physical problems, and also that may activate undesirable emotions like a desire for revenge and anger and all those kinds of things. So those were all part of my hesitation with the process. And also that it wouldn't really fit with Buddhist ideals of detachment. That the idea that you shouldn't sort of excavate these traumatic memories and cultivate them and nurture them, that they should be something that you're released from. But I would say that one of the good things in the way that the therapy was actually implemented was that I think they were able to avoid a lot of these pitfalls just through being sensitive to the dynamics and also screening people before they underwent therapy. I mean, for example, if they felt that someone was too psychologically unstable to undergo the therapy, they would not do this therapy with them. So there has to be a certain baseline in someone's life of stability. And that's something that is really interesting in studies of narrative and healing. There have been studies in psychology that show that talking about traumatic events is not always a good idea. that it depends in what context and how you talk about them. And so that, for example, people whose lives continue to be really unstable and difficult, and who in the process of creating a narrative are not able to create some sort of positive trajectory, that it can actually have negative mental health outcomes. So that's always the thing that you have to be really careful about, and that there is that danger that if you don't do it in the right setting, if you do it with the wrong individual, and if you create the wrong kind of narrative, that those could all have negative mental health outcomes. And I think, as I said, this idea of narrative is actually really nuanced, because there are so many different ways that narratives can be created through a narrative therapy process. And I think the fact that also this therapy is administered by Cambodian counselors really helps, because I think people have a natural sense of sort of that dance of the interaction of what's appropriate and inappropriate, and when you might be pressing a little too much, or being a little too forward or going a little bit too far, and you need to back off, and all of those kinds of things. And so I observed that a lot, and I think people were really skillful in doing that. I was just going to mention, in terms of different kinds of therapies, I think when we think of narrative therapy, we always go back usually to psychotherapy, and we think of that as kind of the model. But there are a lot of different kinds of models for narrative therapy around the world. And one that's particularly intriguing to me is, I'm not sure if you know the Japanese introspective practice of Nikon.
There with that one.
Yeah, it's actually one of my committee members studies this, Chikako Ozawa de Silva. And in the process of Nikon, people work to reconstruct and remember their past, but they do it in relation to significant figures in their life. And then they ruminate on 3 different questions. One question is, what did I receive from this person? Another question is, what did I give back to this person? And then another question is, what trouble did I cause this person? And so through doing that, people are able to sort of shift their perspective. If you look at your life and reconstruct your life story from the perspective of someone else, and what you may have taken or given to them, and any trouble you might have caused them, that sort of can create a really important shift in perspective that has a lot of beneficial effects. And so I think that in the same way in testimonial therapy, if it's done properly, people don't recall their lives from the vantage point of other people, but they can recall events in a different manner, and oftentimes in a way that might make them feel more empowered, I would say, about their lives and about their current situation, and usually are able to create that kind of positive trajectory. Not always, but usually they're able to do it.
Very interesting. I'm wondering, you're mentioning some of the types of people that that TPO and worked with, that you studied as having to have a certain level of stability. But I'm wondering, among which populations and which areas and which kind groups of people were part of your study?
Oh, sure. So I would say they were all older people who had lived through the Khmer Rouge period. And they were oftentimes people who did have a pretty significant level of reported psychological distress that was related to the Khmer Rouge period. But in terms of what I said about stability, for example, if the person seemed to have an active substance abuse problem, they usually were not included in therapy, or if they had evidence of psychosis and those sorts of things. So if they had trauma-related symptoms, for the most part, it was okay for them to participate, but not other sorts of major mental disturbances. And they were people who were drawn from several different provinces, from Tabang Khmum, Prey Veng, Battambang, and Persat, and also some from Kampong Cham. And they were different in terms of, one of the things I thought was really interesting in terms of their sort of political background, I guess you would say. Some of them were former New people and some of them were former base people, Net Mulatan, which I know is the focus of your book, Forest is Struggle, is about the recollections of the base people, which I think is really fascinating because it's not sort of the dominant narrative that we've often heard of the Khmer Rouge period. And then there were also, I'd say pretty even, maybe actually no, I wouldn't say even mix of men and women. There were somewhat more women than men. And also some, in terms of special groups, sometimes also that TPO works with, they did special work, I would say, with Muslim populations, and also then with victims of gender-based violence, which were classified as victims of gender-based violence because they had been in forced marriages under the Khmer Rouge.
Right, interesting. Did any patterns emerge at all of people from, let's say, one type of region versus another type of region? Did you notice any regional differences in the types of trauma they experienced, or ways of recalling that trauma, talking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest difference I saw was between the former base people and the former New people, who also usually fell into the groups of being from different geographical areas. But a lot of the New people did have a story that adhered more to what we think of as the standard narrative of the Khmer Rouge, starting really focusing with the 1975 evacuation of Phnom Penh, and then really focusing on those years of democratic Kampuchea and the sort of targeting of intellectuals and urbanites and all those kinds of people. And then tapering off, around 1979. I would say, though, that all of the testimonies, they're not only focused on those years. They all start off with a little bit about the person's childhood, and they all end with a little bit about the person's present life. So it was just a question about how the shape of the narrative was. Like, for the New people would be, not a whole lot in the early life, and then 1975, 1979, and then not a whole lot afterwards. And then for the people who were the former base people, there was a lot more sort of in the 1970 to 1975 years, and then also in the 1979 to late 1990s. There was a lot more that was narrated that was not seen as being necessarily as important in the testimonies of former New people. And I would say also the American bombings were a big thing that came up in the former base people narratives, and the idea that oftentimes, because these were people too who may have been former Khmer Rouge soldiers or associated with different people in the Khmer Rouge, and I think there was always a desire to explain, that there were these bombings and that people felt that they needed to go into the forest and fight for their country, and that they thought it was an act of patriotism. And that often then what would happen is, if these were people who had initially been allied with the Khmer Rouge, they would be sort of internally purged, and for one reason or another. And that was often their experience of sort of the actual democratic Kampuchea period.
Right. Well, it makes a lot of sense that the base people would talk more about the early 70s, the bombings, and also the after, the 80s and 90s,
Mm-hmm.
because in the 70s, the Khmer Rouge were already occupying so many of those areas already, well before they made it into Phnom Penh and took Phnom Penh. So people's memory of the Khmer Rouge goes back, and their memory of living under the Khmer Rouge goes back, at least back to 1973 in most cases. By 73, the Khmer Rouge already controlled a fair amount of the countryside, and the bombings ended in 73, but those bombings were happening also in the countryside and not in the city. So that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. After the after 79, then of course the Civil War continued through the 80s and 90s. And so the several of those villages, certainly in the area where I worked, was continuously being reoccupied by the Khmer Rouge. And it was sort of a back and forth thing between the government soldiers and the Khmer Rouge. So that makes sense. It's interesting to hear more about that though from you.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it was really fascinating to hear those stories too, because as I said, it's not sort of the standard narrative that we hear. And then for them, the idea of like, what was the Khmer Rouge? It extends for a much longer period of time. And also there were some people that, didn't even necessarily signal 1975 as being an important year, which was shocking to me because, we have our idea of a historical timeline of what are the really significant events. And then if someone in their own perception of their own life, that it wasn't that big of a change, is not what we expect. That was really surprising to me. And then I think also just all of the very vivid descriptions of the American bombings, and also being someone who's an American citizen, that was very impactful, that I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, we were responsible for that. I would say that the other big difference I noticed in the narratives of the former base people is that they would talk more about divisions within the Khmer Rouge, because oftentimes because they had been sort of purged. So they had been part of some faction where something had happened. And so they would talk about the Khmer Rouge not as sort of like this sort of opaque and indecipherable entity, but as, a very real conglomeration of very, very human actors who were often, fighting amongst themselves. So that was another major difference.
That's interesting. Well, we've got, a few minutes left before we get to the, I guess it's in Cambodia, but it must be the 8 o'clock hour here. It's the 9 o'clock hour in the evening. So is there anything that, is there some particular takeaways from your research? I know that you're in the midst of writing up your dissertation right now and probably haven't reached all your conclusions yet. As I know from experience how that process goes.
It's not the fun part.
No, it's definitely not the fun part. So I feel, but you'll get through it. And I'm really looking forward to reading it when it's done. But in the meantime, though, just, from where you are at now, is there any, key takeaways that you found from the research that you've done, plus all the additional experience you've had before you even started your PhD, that kind of stand out to you a little bit, that keeps you thinking about things and may perhaps inspire some other work later on?
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the things that really sticks with me is just still that there is a tremendous need for more services. That the mental health ramifications of the Khmer Rouge and all of the additional years of warfare are still something that affect people, and that also affect intergenerational relationships. And in terms, there are a few different areas I'm interested in for future research, but that is one area that I'm interested in, is, how does this kind of history affect dynamics within a family and affect things like ideas about parenting and all that kind of stuff. I would say also the need to be, culturally sensitive in our treatment approaches in a number of different ways, and to really, really think very carefully about how you're implementing different treatment protocols and why you're doing so. And also to try to really get as much input from people in the country as you can, to try to really get a sense of what's appropriate and what's going to be effective for people. And then also, I would say that there is this kind of generational gap now in Cambodia, and especially being someone who's been there over the years, not as long as you have been working in Cambodia, but for an extended period of time. And, it's exciting in a lot of ways to see the energy and the dynamism of the young people, and see how that social reconstruction is successful in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I guess I would say I hope that people don't forget about the older people, and to try to, I know that sounds kind of nagging me, that I'm like, call your mother, call your grandmother, but that sometimes when a society is developing so rapidly, that the older people can really feel left behind and sort of obsolete. And so I think that it's important to continue to incorporate them into different things, and to try to make resources available to them.
Right, absolutely. I agree. Call your mother.
Yeah, exactly.
And listen to them and listen to their stories.
Right. They actually have some important things to say.
Yeah, it's something that people often become more aware of and interested as they get older. Is when you're young, you're busy trying to start your life and going to school and starting jobs and all of those things. So it's understandable. But yeah, I mean, Cambodia, though, of all places, it's better than here in terms of people do seem to have, they have a lot more respect towards their elders and are more involved with them quite often than in our own society.
Oh yeah, I would say they're still way better than the US. There's no question. But
yeah. Well, thank you very much, Elena. I have more questions, of course, for you, but I see that there are some questions here. I think they're in the chat here. Let me see.
I don't know. I've seen some things moving in the chat and some things moving in the Q&A.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to start here by asking you questions from the Q&A first, because I'm not sure where on the list of chat, at least how I'm seeing it at the moment. I'm somewhere in the middle, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I am either.
So if you're ready for some questions from those people who are here with us tonight, we'll get going here. How's that sound?
Sure.
Okay, so first question is from Kristen. Were there any interviews done with former Khmer Rouge soldiers?
Yes, there were. Yeah. As I was mentioning, that was one of the sort of interesting things about the therapy that was a little bit surprising to me, because I, at first thought, well, are former Khmer Rouge soldiers considered to be perpetrators? And there are a lot of people who are really sort of in that gray line, in that gray area. And because I had asked at first, at TPO, I said, do you do the therapy with perpetrators? And they said no. And then I would find that some people had been former Khmer Rouge soldiers, but then, like I said, they were people who weren't really considered to be perpetrators because they had then been in some way persecuted by the Khmer Rouge. And so, but at the same time, of course, people are telling their own stories. So we don't necessarily know the extent, of the activities that they participated in or didn't participate in. So, I mean, that's always a subject then that's a little bit touchy. But yeah, they did participate. And like I said, a lot of them had also really gone through a lot of terrible and tragic events and lost family members, and were suffering from a lot of mental health issues as well. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. So 1 second here.
I think she just followed up that she had been thinking about the children who were separated and made into enforcers. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'd say there were people who were definitely young adults during the Khmer Rouge time, and then that once again ties into this question of accountability and how accountable, like are there different levels of accountability, and how do you hold people responsible? And Cambodia, in terms of actual justice processes, has obviously taken a much more narrow approach to who is actually legally held accountable. And as I mentioned before, in Rwanda, that was an interesting point of comparison, because Rwanda took a much broader approach to accountability.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a question here from Borabai. Thank you so much for your in-depth presentation. I have a question regarding testimonial therapy. What can be the major challenge or barrier to treat the trauma of mental health of Cambodia? Also, do you think the trauma effect of the Khmer Rouge can impact Cambodia's youth?
Yeah, so in terms of major barriers to treatment, well, I think there are a few things. I think that, as I mentioned before, one problem is just a lack of resources and a lack of education about these kinds of issues. And I know that TPO and other organizations do try to get information out there. But there's only so much that they can do, and they're relatively small teams when you think about the whole country, and also the fact that so many people are in rural areas spread out from each other. It can be hard to really reach people. So I think that so resources are a major issue. There may still be some issue with stigma. In different places, although I think, and what I've heard from people is that stigma about having mental health issues is not as strong necessarily as it once was. So that's a good thing. Anything that you can do to sort of destigmatize mental health problems. And can it impact the youth? Well, as I said, this is one thing I am potentially interested in looking more into in future areas of study. But from different parts of the world, I would say that there have been a number of studies that show intergenerational transference of trauma or of different sort of trauma-related behaviors. And so I would think that there may be, I mean, we can't necessarily say, oh, because someone has PTSD that their kid is going to have PTSD. Of course not. But if they have PTSD, maybe that affects the way that they parent their kid, and maybe they're really, really overly anxious in the way that they parent their kid, or maybe they're very detached in the way that they parent their kid, and then that affects that child and their development and the way that they sort of perceive the world and interact with the world. So I think that any sort of major trauma can definitely have intergenerational effects. And I think especially in terms of the idea of kind of having hypervigilance, because oftentimes people who are survivors of very traumatic events do adopt this sort of stance of hypervigilance to the world, because it's almost like a veteran coming out of a war. You know, when you hear about veterans who come back from Iraq or Afghanistan and they go to the grocery store and they're always scoping out in the grocery store, you know, are there any enemies behind the boxes of soda, or, you know, because they're just used to being in this state of hyper arousal. And in order to survive, that if someone is in that state, the way that they sort of parent their child is going to be affected. So we can't know necessarily what all the implications are, but I think there are definitely a lot of different implications.
Okay, great. I see a question here from Penny. Are you aware of any other methods that were known or practiced by Cambodians that already deal with a severe trauma like this? Before your awareness of testimonial therapy, that is?
Oh yeah, definitely. People have been self-treating with a lot of different methods. I should have probably mentioned that earlier. This isn't sort of a vacuum in which people haven't been doing anything. And then, you know, it's just testimonial therapy is just one approach. But I would say that even most of the people who were undergoing testimonial therapy also used different methods of treatment. Sometimes they would go to monks and they would undergo Buddhist blessings. It was something that would sort of lift their spirits and make them feel better. Sometimes they went to different kinds of Kru Khmer. And then, of course, there have been a number of other also psychological interventions that are more sort of technical treatment methods that have been used in Cambodia. But yeah, we shouldn't forget that people also have methods that they have been using for decades, and that quite often probably provide some beneficial effects, and that those shouldn't necessarily be discouraged. I think sometimes that there's, that people think that traditional healing is backward, or, that if someone is interested in like the science of, mental health treatment and what's official mental health treatment, that they shouldn't also be interested in traditional healing. But I think that, if people want to sort of draw from a broad array of traditions, that's often what's best for them.
Right. And I would just add to that, it's, Cambodia has a long history, and there's been some, very traumatic ruptures and terrible, violent episodes in its history in the past. And one thing that's been true is that Cambodia has not only recovered from it, but, people have actually later on managed to thrive and have very good lives. So the resources are there within Cambodian culture. Doesn't have to be imported in. This is just in the global world that we live in. There are different methods that come in and that are exchanged, but certainly my contention has always been that within Cambodian culture, there are many, many different ways and forms of dealing with these mass atrocities, and situating them in such a way that people can move forward with their lives again.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So there shouldn't be a sense to sort of look down on things that are domestic and then think that things that come from outside are necessarily superior. They might not be. But, to look at them all as different tools that might be more or less relevant in different situations.
Right. So here's a question from Sotia. Hello, Sotia, by the way, back. What way should we treat Cambodian people's mental health? I have seen nowadays, even when they meet with problems in daily lives, they are afraid to fight for justice. They are very frightened because of their nightmares from the Pol Pot regime.
Yes, well, that is, that's interesting, that that question about fighting for justice, because one of the things that is incorporated into this, which I didn't actually talk about in my presentation very much, but Sotira Chim, who is the president of TPO and who's a psychiatrist, has written about this idea of Boxbot as a syndrome of distress, as a trauma-related syndrome of distress. And in that work, part of what he incorporates into this is submissive behavior, in terms of being an effect of traumatic experiences that is very sort of pervasive in Cambodian society. The thing is, though, sometimes justice and healing, we have to tease them apart and think about, do they necessarily go together? Do they always go together? Will one person's individual healing, and is justice necessary for one person's individual healing, or are there other resources that they can draw on in a way that, for example, might not lead to different kinds of social conflict and that sort of thing, since social harmony is also a value that's prized in Cambodia, and I think really wisely. And so in terms of, it's hard to give a sort of blanket answer in terms of how to address people's mental health, because I think it's going to be really different for each individual. And I would say, though, a general sort of complaint that I've heard is that a lot of people feel that a lot of the treatment in Cambodia is too medication focused. Well, that's probably true in the US, right? Too. Everyone's on medication. And especially medication that is sort of just has sedative effects, that just kind of makes people sleepy and drowsy. And, so I think that one of the things that would be really beneficial in Cambodia is if more people had access to different sort of behavioral kinds of therapies, or talk therapies that were appropriate, or self-help groups, basically non-medication forms of mental health therapy. And I'm not saying that medication isn't important. It is, and oftentimes medication can be life-saving and life-changing for people. But sometimes if that's the only thing that you rely on, it's not enough. And there are different strategies that you can use to help the person change their behavior patterns that aren't necessarily dependent on medication. And so, but as I said, but the big problem with all of this is resources. Is how do you actually get the resources to get people trained to do that kind of work and then able to actually carry it out in different parts of the country.
So I just am wondering a little on that as you talk about it. So when you were doing the testimonial therapy or doing the research with that, so that is a type of therapy in and of itself, but were there other types of resources that were being provided by TPO and so forth that to, because as you said, that for different people, different things will work better or worse, or their needs might be different. And I imagine as the individuals who were participating in the study were going through this, they would also be talking probably with their family members who may be experiencing some trauma as well as a result of that. So I'm just wondering whether there was any kind of connection with other types of programs or with, with the local, with the monks there, or with other types of resources perhaps that would also, that TPO is working with, or that you were working with at all during your study?
Yeah. Well, as I said, many of the people were already anyway using sort of traditional healing methods, or had used them in the past, many of them also were regulars at their local Watts. I would say they were often very involved in sort of Buddhist activity, and I think that was important. In terms of other therapeutic programs, the NGO does have a number of other kinds of therapeutic programs for different groups. And some of those are more individual therapy. And then they also have self-help groups for different types of people as well. So depending on who you are, yes, they could offer different treatment. But as I said, it is just one NGO. And so that's part of the problem, is that there aren't a whole lot of resources outside of that. And especially in terms of the government, I mean, I think that services are kind of overwhelmed. And oftentimes that's why the default is to turn to medication, because it's a triage approach that you're just trying to get things under control. And you don't necessarily, and you just want to manage the situation, but you don't necessarily have the time or the resources to delve deep into someone's personal life and history.
Right. Yeah. So there's a question. I presume you see it in the chat there.
Let me see.
Asking about what were the things that were causing the nightmares and sleeplessness at night. I am interpreting that question to mean that might be referring to something you were talking about earlier in your talk about people reporting problems with sleeping and nightmares and so forth. Do you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd say that and nightmares and sleeplessness are something that I continued to hear people talk about, which I just always felt. I've experienced insomnia before myself, and I just know how terrible and disorienting it is. And I would say that a lot of them, it was related to traumatic events that had happened under the Khmer Rouge period, or they would be dreams that would be interpreted as spiritual visitation, as instances of spiritual visitation, especially related to relatives who had died during the Khmer Rouge period and were coming back for one reason or another.
So what would people what would people do to help?
Oh, well, when they had these kind of dreams, oftentimes I would say they would go to the pagoda, and they would visit monks and oftentimes try to have different kinds of blessings. So that was something that they did. I don't think that I necessarily heard people say that they would talk to other people about it. So that's interesting. They didn't usually say, oh, I'll talk to my neighbors or my children or anything about it. And that might have to do also with this idea, as I was mentioning before, that just this idea of narrative as healing is not necessarily as deeply embedded in Cambodian society, that the idea that you necessarily need to talk everything out.
Right. There's another related question here from Sotia, who's asking, I'll read it, but he said, to your experience, Elena Lesley, what nightmares do you still remember from Pol Pot? In order to forget it, do you have some websites or that we can search on, or that you could share with the Cambodian people? I assume they might be talking about your family's experiences.
Oh, okay.
I'm wrong, Sotia, just please correct me. But are you asking about Elena's personal background?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I have nightmares myself about that. Although I will say that in terms of this idea of, I guess, what you would call sort of transmitted trauma or vicarious trauma, that during the period of time that I was doing the project on the Khmer Rouge tribunal and covering the Doik trial, that I did actually start to have nightmares related to the Khmer Rouge, which was interesting because, of course, I have never lived through the Khmer Rouge. And so these were all just images and stories and stuff that had been sort of implanted in my mind through the testimony that I was hearing. But I would say in terms of the dreams that people tell me about that they have, oftentimes they're related. They often just talk about people being in black. You know, they talk about what people are wearing, that they're back in that time, that people are in black, that they have short hair, and oftentimes that they're seeing loved ones that passed away during that time. And sometimes the loved ones also come to them and make specific requests. Like that they want them to say a prayer from them somewhere, or also one thing that I heard a lot around the time of Pachumben was that the relatives would come and they would want them to cook certain food for them, you know, to make as an offering during Pachumben. In terms of websites, I will have to think of that. I don't off the top of, I assume what you're asking about is, are there websites that have resources that can help people with nightmares? And I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can try to look into it and see if I can send some things to the organizers at CKS.
That's great. Yeah, we would love to have those. Absolutely. So I'm going to jump in here with a question, actually, that I wanted to ask. There's a message back from Sotia.
Oh,
I am so sorry for this question. I know you're feeling my mom passed away because of it too.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
So I have a question which is slightly taking a different direction a little bit here.
Sure.
It's more looking to the future rather than the past at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So very curious to know that I know you're right at this point of, wrapping up your dissertation and so forth. Your plan to submit it, next year. I don't know which month, but I know you mentioned 2022, which is very exciting.
It's coming up very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I was wondering, what is it that you have any particular projects in mind that you want to do after you're finished with your dissertation? Is there something that sort of piqued your interest as you've been working on this that you would like to explore when you're finished?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say there are a few different areas I'm thinking about. one thing is that I would like to turn the dissertation into a book. So I'll be working toward that aim of turning the dissertation into a book. And then also, I think that there were two groups that I was working with, as I mentioned before, when I was doing my dissertation, that were sort of earmarked specifically for therapy that I'm particularly interested in. And one was these victims of gender-based violence, people who had been in forced marriages. And then the other group would be members of the Muslim minority populations in Cambodia. And in terms of people who were in forced marriages, which I know that that's been ruled as a crime of gender-based violence by the tribunal, although different people may argue the extent to which it's gender-based violence or not, or it may depend on the particular context of the marriage. I mean, I think there was a lot of variation in sort of the degree of coercion of those unions. From this idea of the intergenerational trauma perspective, I'm interested in looking at relationships within those families and how being in a family that was formed through forced marriage might actually affect relationships with subsequent generations. And so that's one area. And then the other area I'm interested in is, as I mentioned, Cambodia's Muslim minority population, which is a very sort of interesting group to study because they are a small group, but very distinct in a lot of ways. And also because they've had increasing sort of interaction with outside Muslim networks that have come to proselytize in Cambodia. So that's another group that I'm interested in doing some additional research in the future with. Of course, also now we've had this completely unanticipated variable of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't know how that might affect things going forward, or if that might actually be something that becomes more of a research focus in some ways, since I have had an interest in health-related issues, and if COVID-19 and the effects of COVID-19 may play a role in my research in the future.
Interesting. So we have time, I think. I'm seeing another question here, and I think we have enough time for it before we wrap up. So this question is from Samuel, who asks, can you speak at all to any of the ideas you may have about how to tap into the resources that are already in Cambodia that can augment mental health services, both in terms of quantity and quality? For example, facilitating more collaboration between monks and NGOs that are providing services and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is important in low resource settings to try to think creatively in terms of the resources that you do have. And also, throwing money at something doesn't necessarily create a good system or a good treatment protocol anyway, as we know. So I think that that's a very good idea to think about what local resources are available. And I think that monks could be a great group of people to tap into. And TPO has already started to do that to some extent. The fact that they have incorporated monks into this testimonial therapy ceremony that they do. I think another thing that you can do is train sort of resource people, and especially if you're working in rural communities and people don't have easy access maybe to a hospital or to a psychiatrist or to a psychologist, that if you go out and train local resource people who can be point people and sort of emergency mental health issues in these different places, that can be one way to sort of begin to address the mental health burden in the country.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Elena. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really can't wait to read your dissertation, or your book for that matter, when you finish that. It's been a real pleasure. I just have a brief announcement before we close tonight about our upcoming webinar in a couple of weeks. So we will have Mr. Boon Sim San, who is from the Mapping Memories Cambodia project, which is Mapping Memories. It's a mobile app. And they also have a website, and the idea here is to find ways of bringing more youth into having an interest in the Khmer Rouge past and learning more about it and being more engaged and more involved. It's a really exciting project, and I'm really looking forward because I will also be hosting that one, like the webinar tonight. So I will be having a discussion with Mr. Boon Sim San, who I believe might be in the audience. In any case, I'm very excited about it. And the date for that will be on the 30th Cambodia time in the morning, and it will be in the evening here in the US on the 29th. So I hope you all come. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day or evening as the case may be. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.